Everybody, welcome to Thursday. Today we're going to be looking at the gouache. I don't have the physical gouache is in my distribution department, but what I did today is I took scans. They certainly look better than the camera that tries to color correct. Still not perfect with the scanner, but they're closer to what I'm seeing here on my desk. So I thought we would start looking at those. So Anna Marie, Ethel, Giovanni, I'm not seeing Facebook come across on mine. I'm sure it is somewhere, but it's not on mine. So if you could relay the messages, that would be great.
Sure.
I'd appreciate it. Okay, so we'll start by looking at the gouache, and I took some scans today. Ethel, can we see those?
Sure. We
Please.
begin with, as John has it in alphabetical order. So we start with this. There you go, John.
Okay, so on the right-hand side, we're seeing the watercolor buff titanium. And what that is a wash of 1 part buff titanium watercolor to 10 parts water. And then it's mixed and the chemist does a wash. The scanner kind of whited out the bottom, but you can kind of see the top. And on the left-hand side is the gouache. And this is going to be true for each one of them that we see. The top of the gouache, that's mass tone. That's right out of the tube. So the top one is mass tone. The middle one is 1 part gouache to 1 part water. And the bottom one is 1 part gouache to 1 part water to 1 part titanium white. And what we're trying to show with the last one is when you look at the middle, which is 1 part gouache to 1 part water, you can see it is still extremely opaque. And we added that because some artists are going to add water to the gouache. They're not going to use typically the mass tone, which is the top. And so what the bottom one is showing you, it's how opaque this particular gouache really is. If you look at the middle one, okay? And certainly if you look at the top. So if we look at the next one, the next slide. Okay, this is burnt sienna. So again, on the right-hand side, we're seeing the burnt sienna watercolor. And both the top and the bottom are 1 to 10, 1 part paint to 10 parts distilled water, and then mixed and then a wash done. So the bottom part is just a gradient where the loaded brush goes from loaded to as unloaded as in get within the amount of paper available. And on the left-hand side, we see the gouache. The top again is mass tone. The middle one is 1 to 1, 1 part gouache to 1 part watercolor. And the bottom one is 1 to 1 to 1, 1 part paint to 1 part water to 1 part titanium white. And what we're showing you on the first and the second is just how opaque that color is. Even when you add the titanium white in the last one, it is nowhere near as opaque as the 1 to 1 or the mass tone out of the tube. Okay, can we look at the next one? So this one is burnt umber, and right-hand side watercolor, left-hand side gouache. And you can see how opaque the gouache is. What you're also seeing here on the watercolor is you're seeing our favorite thing, which for many of you, which is the flocculation or the granulation. And on the left-hand side, we're not going to see that. Okay, it's very, the gouache is very opaque. It's loaded with pigment, and we're not seeing that granulation. So you're not going to get, even if a watercolor is a transparent watercolor, you're not going to see that within the gouache. The gouache will be opaque. Okay, can we see the next one, please?
May I ask a question about the previous one, about burnt umber?
Yep.
In the scan, it looked nearly black on the top one and 90% black on the middle one. Is that just a mistake with the scan
Yeah, let me try to show
for
you.
the camera?
So this is kind of what it looks like. You can see it's way more earthy here. And then when I scan it, there's nowhere for it to go when it scans. So it kind of pushes toward the dark. Even this camera pushes it kind of toward the dark. I think the only way for me to correct that is to shoot it with an SLR.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for catching that. Yeah. Okay, so if we can see, this is Cascade Green. So right-hand side watercolor, you can see the granulation, the Cascade Green. You can see kind of in the graded wash toward the bottom. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4 on the fourth bar, how you can see a little bit of that yellow coming out of the Cascade Green because it's co-precipitated, and the pigments are being forced apart. You can force that apart if you add, extra water. And if we look at the left-hand side, we're seeing the gouache, and the gouache doesn't have that effect. Okay, so if you can see the next one, this is the cobalt blue. So the cobalt blue is a granulating color. You can see the watercolors granulating there. And on the left-hand side, you see mass tone up on top, then the 1:1, and then the 1:1:1. Okay. So the gouache has a Giovanni was saying it very well. It has a fluffy look to it. It's a really kind of a beautiful look to it here in front of me. With the watercolor, you're actually seeing the pigment, you're actually seeing the pigment. There's just so much of it at the gouache, and that's why you're seeing a difference between the two. Okay, can we see the next one? This is Hansa Yellow Deep. It's a beautiful color. That's a beautiful color. So you see on the right-hand side in the watercolor, a 1:10 again, and then a gradient 1:10. And then on the left-hand side, we see the gouache, and you can see that it's a very matte gouache. Okay, can we see the next one, please? This is Hansa Yellow Light. Right side watercolor and left side gouache. So the top, as many artists are going to use it in this format, which is the mass tone, and then the 1:1 is the middle, and then 1:1:1, which is 1 part of the paint to 1 part water to 1 part titanium white. And all we're showing in the last one is even with the added white, you can see that the middle one is still more opaque. So in other words, we don't add white. We don't need to add white because the color is, we're just putting so much pigment, it is actually super opaque. Okay, so the ones that we just saw, they were all semi-transparent, each one of them. So the burnt titanium, buff titanium, sorry, burnt sienna, burnt umber, Cascade Green, Hansa Yellow Deep, Hansa Yellow Light, and Hansa Yellow Medium were all semi-transparent watercolors. And so the gouache takes it into opaque. 1, 2, 3, 4. The first 5 were actually granulating, and you saw for the gouache, they do not granulate. So now we'll look at the next one, which is Indian Red. So Indian Red, you can see that it's granulating. Indian Red is an opaque watercolor. And even though it's an opaque watercolor, it doesn't come close to the gouache. So just adding the, that the additional pigment really drives it to super opaque. So there might be a little bit of confusion thinking, well, Indian red's already an opaque watercolor, and it is an opaque watercolor. So a gouache and a watercolor are not the same. Even though it's the same exact binder and it's the same exact pigment, they're made differently in that we're just adding a huge amount of pigment. So you can look at the top here, or even the middle of the gouache, which is a 1:1, and the top of the Indian red is a 1:10. It is just super opaque. The gouache is really, really opaque. If you compare the Indian red to a burnt umber, for example, or a Hansa, you would see that, yes, it is opaque compared to those other watercolors, but it's not opaque as the gouache. Okay, if we look at the next one. So this again is a non-granulating color. This is lamp black, and it is opaque. It is super opaque as a gouache. So when I show you the white, you'll see the titanium white is a really, really, really bright white, and the lamp black as a gouache is a really, really, really dark black. Okay, so we'll look at the next one. This is lavender. Lavender is a granulating color. It is semi-transparent, as you can see there. In the gouache, it is just extremely opaque. There's a black bar on the right-hand side of the gouache drawdown. And what you can see on the top is that it completely covers the black. And on the middle one, it does a really, really good job on covering the black. So if we look at the next one, this is permanent green. So permanent green is a transparent watercolor. And you can see the counterpart, which is the gouache, is opaque. If we look at the top with a 1:1, you don't see the black. The black is not there. It's opaque. And even in the middle, you can see that it's opaque, whereas the watercolor is transparent. Okay, if we look at the next one, this is pyrrole orange. The pyrroles, they're gorgeous. They're gorgeous in the gouache and they're gorgeous in the watercolors. They're so bright. So in the watercolor, they're semi-transparent, and you can see that they're non-granulating. If we look at the gouache, it is extremely opaque and extremely bright. You can see that in the first and the second picture. Okay, if we look at the next one, it's pyrrole orange. Pyrrole orange. So we look at pyrrole orange. I'm sorry, that's my mistake. This is pyrrole red. So pyrrole red is also a semi-transparent. Very bright, much brighter. While that the screenshot is very bright, if you've used pyrrole red is really, really bright. It's like fire engine red. It's just gorgeous. It is semi-transparent, and the gouache, it's opaque. So you can see the top, there's no black. In the middle one, which is a 1:1, it's still considered to be very opaque. If we can look at the next one, which is pyrrole scarlet. Yeah. So pyrrole scarlet, again, it's semi-transparent. It's a very bright color, very pretty color. And in the gouache, it's super, super opaque. There's no black. And look in the top mass tone, there's no black. And even in the middle, it's extremely opaque. Okay, if we look at the next one, this is quinacridone magenta. And quinacridone magenta is a transparent. So you can see the top. It doesn't really, the copier made it look a little, scanner made a little bit look different than what I have in front of me. It does its best job even at 600 dots per inch. But what you can see from this image is that it's extremely opaque. So if we look at the gouache, it's very, very opaque in that top image. It looks quite beautiful in front of me, not so beautiful in that scan. But I'm just showing you that it's the thing about the gouache is that it makes it very, very opaque. And we're accomplishing all the opaqueness just by using more pigment. Okay. So if we look at the next one, the next one is
May I ask a follow-up question on that?
yes.
You're describing that it's opaque because of more pigment. Are you saying that in contrast to competitors that would be using binders and fillers and other just filling material? Is that to put a contrast there? So that as an artist, I can say, oh, this is opaque because of quality and not because of fillers.
So that's a good question. So what we're showing on the bottom is with titanium white. And you can see that the middle, which is just the load with a 1-to-1, 1 part paint to 1 part water, still is more opaque than the one below it, which would have the titanium white, which should make it opaque, right? You're adding a white to it. But there's so much pigment in our gouache, there's no need to use the white. It's just opaque because of the amount of pigment. So to answer your question, I could make it cheaper, right? So the thing to look, I could make it cheaper by adding a calcium carbonate, by adding a cheaper white. It would just make it cheaper. Would it make it opaque? It would make it opaque. But you could catch it in the drawdowns. You'd see it. Our market is the professional artist, and it's for us, it's just keeping in line with our current product, which is we just add more pigment. It's more costly to do that, obviously. I've made the price between the two, the watercolor and the gouache, the same. I will tell you they're not the same. You can't add more of something and have it be the same. So, but to us, that's reasonable. What we're doing is giving something to our customers that they could put in their toolbox.
John,
That answer that,
Yeah.
Anna? I hear you. Did
Are
that
you-
answer the question?
Are you saying that this is, am I hearing also that this is what separates you from a competitor? Is you're
That's
not
what separates-
using fillers?
That's what separates us from competitors that would use something else additionally to get theirs darker. We're not doing that. We're adding just more of the pigment.
So what I'm hearing as a professional artist is I'm hearing quality rather than economy.
That would be
On
correct.
your, okay, thank you for clarifying, helping me.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a good question. Yes, Ian.
is there a direct correlation between the watercolor particle size and the gouache size?
Yeah. So gouache isn't a size. So you're saying what's the difference between the watercolor and the gouache with the same name, raw sienna gouache versus raw sienna watercolor? So
As in the particles, how big they are?
yes, so gouache can be made with a larger particle size.
Yeah.
We're not doing that. We're taking the same exact pigment that's in our watercolor, and to cover the black or cover the paper, however you want to think about that, we're just adding more particles. So by putting a heavier load, it covers that area, and that's what we want from a gouache, is for it to be opaque, and we're accomplishing that through adding more pigment.
So that's what gives you your greater opacity.
Yes.
It's like a particle per milliliter or whatever.
Yes, you could accomplish that by using a larger particle size. We're not doing that. We're using the same exact pigment that's in the raw sienna is the same exact pigment that's in the raw sienna gouache. There's just more of it.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're very welcome. My pleasure. The next one is spring green. And spring green is a semi-transparent. It's a pretty color. You can see that the top is opaque in the gouache. That's a mass tone. That's right out of the tube. And in the middle, again, it's the 1 to the 1. And the bottom is 1 to 1 to 1. 1 part paint to 1 part water to 1 part titanium white. And all we're showing there is the middle, which just has the water, and the gouache is more opaque than the one with the titanium. So we don't, there's no reason to add anything. Just the additional pigment makes ours very, very opaque. The next one, next one is titanium white. So this is titanium white, and you can kind of see that outline of the one that the top one where it's over the where it's on the white paper. It is just so bright. It is so loaded. And usually you can tell a really good gouache by how black the black is and how white the white is. And the black is black, 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 and the white is white, 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 white. So very good titanium white and lamp black. Because, okay, so the next one. And if you're asking questions on Facebook, Anna and Giovanni and Letiza and Ethel will read those across. This right here is my favorite color. I like a lot of the colors, but this one's my favorite just because blue, and the blue in the gouache is just gorgeous. So this is ultramarine. It's semi-transparent. You can see in the gouache, it is really, really, really opaque. So very opaque watercolor. Very opaque gouache, I'm sorry, very opaque gouache. And then the next one, which is wisteria. So this is wisteria. Can we go back to the ultramarine? So the ultramarine is a transparent watercolor. So on the watercolor is transparent, on the gouache, it's opaque. Okay, thank you, Ethel. Can we go back to now go to wisteria? Okay, this is wisteria. Wisteria is semi-transparent. You can see on the top, that's mass tone. So it's a very opaque color. And then again, it's the 1 to 1, 1 part paint to 1 part water in the middle. And then it's 1 to 1 to 1 on the bottom. And the last one is yellow ochre. And yellow ochre is a transparent watercolor. And you can see that it's a granulating transparent watercolor as a watercolor, which is on the right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, we can see it as an opaque gouache. The top being mass tone meaning straight out of the tube. The middle being 1 to 1, 1 part paint to 1 part water. And the last one, 1 part paint to 1 part water to 1 part titanium dioxide or titanium white. Okay, that's all 22 colors. And so those will be out. Those are in our distribution center. So it'll be however stores, etc., want to take them out. We're ready to ship in November.
Do you have a color chart yet?
One more time, please.
Do you have a color chart yet?
The color chart is now done. I think Jen, so yes, the color chart is done. And I know they're coming out with a dot card as well. So you can actually see them from a dot card.
Nice.
The color chart is posted online.
And the color chart is posted online. So that's Jen.
I'll put that website where it is on the chat.
Thanks, Jen. We have a question, John.
Giovanni,
I'm sorry.
Go
I'll
ahead.
just ask you, sorry.
Okay, Ethel.
We have 2 questions here. Thank you, Angela, for placing it over in Zoom chat. This is from Oh, okay, so this may be likely a repeat question, but Kathy wants to know what are the basic differences between gouache and watercolors? And then,
So, okay. So for us, for Daniel Smith, gouache can be made in different ways. There's acrylic gouache and there's watercolor gouache. Ours is a watercolor gouache. Let me restate that. Ours is a water media gouache. I don't want to get confused between watercolor and gouache. So for us, it is the same binder. It's gum arabic, and it's the same exact pigment that's in our watercolor. There's just more of it. So what the gouache tries to do, what it was originally made for, was when photographers would want to take images of their work and not have a glare. So it would be more flat. Back in the days when they were doing that for magazines, etc. And it's used in still used in many places. And we thought, well, that would be just something that would be neat for our customers to try.
the second question, John, from Adam. Do we plan to make gouache in Primatech colors?
You know, I don't know that. I'm certainly open to that. Certainly. The neat thing about the Primatech is the way they granulate, and you would not have that in a gouache. So I would have to, I ask all of you, and as I travel, I'm going to be asking artists. I know Catherine's doing that, and Jen's part of that, and Ethel's part of that. We're asking a lot of input, but there's certain things that the gouache doesn't have, and one of them is the granulation. And many of you really like that granulation within the Primatechs, whether it is the hematite, etc. There's a beauty in that. It would be lost. High probability, almost 100% it would be lost. But not opposed to it. I just need to look to see what does that add to your toolbox. Good question.
John,
Yes, Ian.
You've been experimenting with that powdered paint, haven't you, recently? Powdered watercolor.
Yes,
Would it be usable with that gouache?
So you can definitely use the gouache and the watercolor. I think that's going to take experimenting on your side. Many times the gouache was used for highlights, etc. So again, it's just a tool that as a watercolorist, you're going to have to play with to see how you want to use that particular tool. The watercolor powder, it's going to have it has a mammoth punch to it, right? I mean, it's just unbelievable how packed it is. I was looking at it. You can use it any way you want. This beautiful thing about being an artist is the amount of creativity that comes with it. To me, that's kind of the juice of anything I do, is the amount of creativity I can add to something. But you can sprinkle the powdered paint. You will be able to dip your paint in it, but it's going to have it's going to be intense. So I think that's just, it's going to be for how you want to play with it.
Right. Have you looked at, generally speaking, with gouache, you have to be careful about how thickly you layer. Have you looked and experimented and found out how many layers it can actually take before it becomes unstable?
We've made some of ours very thick, but again, that's something that you're going to have to, because that can vary, right? If different layers, or if I picked 5 of you, you're going to be adding different amounts of water. So, layer from the first person may not be the same for the layer of the second person, because with watercolor, it depends on how much water you're using. We've made some of ours quite thick, but again, that's just going to take individual playing with it.
But has it been experimented on the, you know, the, I keep forgetting what you call it. Your surface.
The ground.
The ground.
Ground.
Yeah.
Because it is the same because it's the same gum arabic, it's the same pigment, it's a water media, it will work very well with the ground.
Right.
John,
Yes, Mohammed.
what's the difference between the poster color and gouache?
So poster colors are usually acrylic. And so our gouache is watercolor.
Because my father was a commercial artist, and in my childhood, I have been seeing him using the water only. And I think the brand he used to use, it was Pelican poster color. They were water soluble, and so they were like acrylic.
So acrylics are water
Around
soluble.
about 45 years ago, they were acrylic, Pelican acrylic.
Yes.
I would have to look, but I would think that's probably what they were, because while it's wet, and acrylic is still miscible in water while it's before it sets. Once it sets, that's kind of the end of it. A watercolor, an easy way to find out if it's a watercolor, it's always it's for ours anyway, it's going to be always regrettable.
Because in my school time and in my college time, I usually use a lot of poster color to make the posters and my drawings and all those. And it was totally different, like what's the acrylic now. And it was just water soluble, and we could dilute it. There was a little bit granulation as well. But they were used as a commercial artists were using it as a poster color for designing commercial art.
Yeah, I don't, that's interesting. Look at that.
Please do that. Yeah, because throughout my childhood, I have seen my father, my grandfather, they were using it and in their commercial art for designing the products and textile designing. They were all using the poster color, Pelican poster color. I think it was a brand at that time.
Yeah, I'll take a look at that.
Please, yeah.
Thank you.
I think the gouache looks like what we used to have is like a Pelican watercolor. They used to come in bottles.
So when I was first learning to paint, I was taught about a designer's watercolor, and it would be the dress designer's watercolor. And it was much like, and I almost feel like I remember that Pelican brand from that time. But I always told my students that gouache was what the designers, if they wanted a red dress with white polka dots, gouache would be what they would use, or you know, using it in that way. And so it did not have the final setup permanence that acrylic has. But all I remember 45 years ago was tempera paint, something that was more permanent or opaque than watercolor, and watercolor and oils. That's all I remember the artists use. So I'm kind of with Muhammad on thinking
Well,
that.
yeah, gouache is kind of a big, it's a big area that a lot of stuff has been thrown into. So there's not a lot of differentiation, even though they're usually different items between an acrylic gouache, for example, or a watercolor gouache. Ours is the watercolor, certainly used within the photography industry of doing design, etc.
John, does it stain
sorry.
like, oh, I'm sorry.
No, continue, please.
Does it stain? Are the ratings on the gouache kind of like, are they the same as the color? Like how staining they are? And I mean, I can't wait to try it, to experiment with it.
So staining is really part of the particle itself. So if it's staining as a watercolor, it's going to be staining for a gouache, our gouache. One that doesn't hold up, however, is granulation. So the granulation, the way if you look at a watercolor and it says this color is granulating, that's most likely not going to exist within the gouache unless you really, really, really wet it down. And if you're really, really, really going to wet it down, you might as well use the watercolor. So those are the things that you're gonna have to think through in that creative space. And then the other piece is going to be the granulation. So, you know, if it's doubtful it's going to granulate, again, granulation is for the most part caused by differential specific gravity. You're not going to have that if every particle that's being used in that gouache is the same, and it is. Wherever they move, they're going to move together. And if they move all together, you're not going to get granulation. So if a color, for example, is granulating as a watercolor, it is pretty close to 100%. If used in mass tone for certain, that it's not going to granulate. Used with a very little bit of water, most likely not going to granulate. Could you get it to granulate if you really, really wet it down? But again, you might as well then be using the watercolor. So it's just another tool, you know, to kind of figure, expand what you might want to accomplish.
Thank you.
Yeah. But we're going to list that on the watercolor chart. We will absolutely list its properties.
Mhm.
So Cascade.
John, we have a couple of questions in Facebook.
Okay.
One of them is by Suliberto. She wants to know if they will come in a set, if these gouache will come in a set.
You know, that's marketing. I think initially, I know they're going to be open stock, and they're going to be open stock initially. That way, artists can choose to buy one or buy three or buy whatever colors they want. And I think after that, we'll can't speak for marketing. They get mad when I speak for them. I'm sure marketing will probably think about making sets afterwards.
So not to start with.
No, there's more flexibility to start with having it be open stock, so artists can choose the colors, you know, in any amount that they want. It's always easier to start that way.
Mm. And there is another question. Thank you, John. There's another question about from Chili Bini Maggie. She says, how do you fraction these, by volume or by eye? I don't understand very well the question. Do you understand it, John?
So how do we fracture them?
Yes, fraction. By
Is that
volume
for
or
the
by eye?
swatches, the ratios?
Oh, so
Could be
you don't have to
the,
you don't necessarily have to do it the same way that we're doing it here. So how we do it, these are all, I take these all from the laboratory. So they're very specific. When I say it's 1-to-1, it's 1-to-1. They'll actually weigh each thing out. They have scales that go down to just, you could weigh the head of a pin. It's in a vacuum. They can weigh, they can and they do weigh everything. So when I say these are 1-to-1, out of the laboratory, they're 1-to-1. Here, it's almost like when I was showing the tinting, you know, you could do a drop and then do a drop to your eye that's 10 times bigger. That's fine if you just want to see it for yourself. But these are actually done in the laboratory, so they really are 1-to-1. They're done by weight. Yes, to answer your question, they're done by weight.
thank you so much. Thank you
You're
so
very
much, John.
welcome. Great question. Yeah. Any other questions? Can I pick on people? Because I see all of you.
Yes, John, you can pick on people.
I will only do it in a very good way. So the colors are going to hit the distribution center in November. I will have probably, I'll bring in next Thursday. I'm leaving
Are they-
California next Thursday, but I'm going to bring some in so you can actually see them here. Actually, I'm going to wait because I think what I'd like to do is, I'm going to wait on that. Yes, was a question?
No, just making sure. The guess was, would it be 15 ml tubes?
Yes. Yeah, good question. Initially, they're going to be 15 mil.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Very good question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Is the tube going to look strikingly different between the two?
You know, it's the same color tube. On the label, however, it's gonna be very clear that it's a gouache. It's gonna say gouache.
Okay.
John, may I ask a question, please?
You certainly can.
What is the lifting power of these? Is it basically the same as the watercolor when you're lifting the paint? I see Gabriel adding some beautiful blues. Can you lift them with adding water to it?
You can, so if again, that's a really good question. If you can lift them, yes, you're able to lift them.
Thank you.
Is you can actually paint over, you don't really have to lift, do you?
I'm
'Cause
sorry.
it's opaque. Because of its property of being opaque, there isn't that much of a need to lift things. You can paint over.
So I think Gabriel, you have the dot card with you right now?
I do.
Can you answer Linda Marie's question?
So typically my experience and the things that I've learned from my friends at Paint and Gouache, there's really not much lifting. It's more like stacking. So really, like if I want to put some nice whites in here, I would actually build up onto this white. Okay. But if I wanted to lighten an area, I sure can. And I would probably not use my favorite brand new, brush. I would probably grab a beater brush that's in the other room. Actually, no, I got one right here. So, for instance, I would wet this area and let it set, and then I can lighten, yes. But as full as get to a full white, no. Unless I were to use maybe like a magic eraser. But the real beauty, I think, with this medium is stacking the paint on top of other colors because of the opacity. But there's gotta say, you could start going mixed media now. You can start using the watercolor and the gouache together. So here we go. We're putting buff titanium onto a darker surface. Like let's say there's some kind of reflection on this side of the cooler building, and I'm just stacking these little bits, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Gabriel. Hey, Giovanni, are you doing the gouache as well?
Yeah.
Can you I'm gonna go to the speaker. Can you show yours? Oh, that's, yeah, very nice. Thank you, Gabriel. And
You're so welcome.
Yeah, it's very, very, very perfect. They have a typical gouache silk effect, and is perfect. It's very, very perfect. Your product.
Like your painting.
I use in this all the color mixing, and the typical gouache effect like me is this.
Oh, wow.
Oh, nice.
That's like
Very opaque and very silk effect. Beautiful, John.
if you've ever seen how egg tempera paintings are done, that's the technique that is applied to a lot of very realistic gouache styles. It's like a dabs of paint on top of one another until you build up, a bit like an oil without having the Hassler oil.
And that's what Gabriel was calling stacking.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah. I use a
Uh-huh.
various label for the.
If you make a mistake, just go over it. Quite good with stuff like that.
Giovanni, did you start that painting as a gouache painting, or is it originally a watercolor underneath?
No, only wash.
Only
Only-
gouache.
But the first layer I use similar to watercolor, more dilution, but the real effect is for example, I started on down. I created the grisaille.
Very nice. I
I
see.
try, for example, I start with pure red. I
Right.
create the trichronomy effect similar to printer machine, and arrive at the dark before the lamp black. I create, and in this painting, starting for the chronologic system with buff titanium, yellow, pure orange, pure scarlet, and I create this. The beautiful effect for the gouache is a covering similar to oil, but have a matte effect that is very, very beautiful.
Oh, very nice.
Yes, very nice.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Giovanni, are you
Excellent.
applying the gouache not so that it doesn't cover everything, so that you can see through to the cafe and see the layers?
Yeah.
Nice.
Every day.
Thank you. So that you're adding a transparency even though the medium itself is not transparent in the technique you're applying.
Yes.
In this technique, I apply many layer of transparency, but in the final effect, I apply a very, very strong, the real effect. I like it.
In watercolor painting, we use a technique though, don't we, where we start off with very, very transparent washes, very rapidly put down, and then slowly but surely, we go from being very washy to medium level on your next level, and then after that, it's dry brush. So it's the building up of that what creates texture.
Yeah, you see the dry brush is, for example, in the dark effect.
And that's what I'm kind of doing now, Ian, is I did a nice little wash, and now I'm building up the paint.
Yeah.
And so, it's nice. I can have these like sketches here, and then I can do a full wash, and then I can leave in some nice little sketches and pencil marks within here, so it can still be as transparent as I want, or even as opaque as I want it to be. But so I have a nice little sketch. I could do a nice little wash and then build up all the paint.
Another good thing about gouache and the way you work with it is it tends to be more closer to the dry media end of things, applied in a more drier way. That means you can actually use it a lot better on lighter paper, like £90, for example, without it buckling and bending. So it's quite a versatile thing, that, in that sense.
I think it is too. There's a question in the chat that is something we mentioned but not talked about, I don't think. But what kind of brushes are best for gouache? Gio, what would you say about that? Because Giovanni,
Oh yeah, sorry.
what brushes would you recommend?
I recommend for the best result. I for example, now I use the Borciani and Bonazzi is a synthetic brush, is a flat brush. It's not not strong, not very hard, but is in the center of the not hard and soft.
Not as soft as watercolor, but not as hard as
No.
oil.
No.
Right.
Now, Giovanni and Gabrielle, would you mix on a palette if you wanted to get colors, or are you just getting things directly from the paint itself?
I don't think you should limit yourself. I think you should do both.
Yeah, I'd encourage people to have a look at 1930s travel posters,
Right.
because they're the classic examples of gouache in its absolute highest point.
The 1930s.
Yeah, 1920. Just
19
and movie, Hollywood movie posters from that period before they started doing superimposed photographs. They used to do like paintings of, you know, the Hollywood stars and that.
Right.
And you look them up, and they're 9 times out of 10 they're gouache.
Wow. So, Gabriel, you had made the comment of not using your favorite watercolor brush. You've been painting with it enough that you definitely know what kind of brush too. What?
So
what-
yeah, I'm not using my brushes that I use with my watercolor brushes. I have a couple of brushes I have off to the side that I use. Sometimes it's nice to just have a couple other brushes that you could set aside. Maybe it'd be something like a travel brush that you could just designate that for when you're doing your gouache. At the end of a watercolor painting, and I'm just using gouache for some highlights of maybe a gouache white, I'll use this perla, which is a synthetic, and that's just designated just for the gouache. And if for some reason I go back to doing watercolor, I'll dump out my water and start with some nice fresh clean water. That's a good question.
Have any of you used soft hog hair brushes? The kind of stuff that they might use for oils?
Have not.
Say that again, Ann. What did you call it? Soft?
It not to be confused with normal hog hair. It's soft hog hair. It's a bit more malleable, but it's stiff enough so that you can push mass tone paint onto the canvas or paper or whatever you're using.
So we'll be doing a lot more testing on or doing a lot more videos on the gouache. Tomorrow, we're going to do, I think we won't have time to do the drawing ink today, the walnut drawing ink. We'll do it next week. Tomorrow, Anders Andersson's going to be with us. Anders is from Sweden. He's a brand ambassador. He is fabulous guy, fabulous artist. He's extremely quick. He comes with us when we do our presentations in Frankfurt, and he's very engaging. He loves questions. So I hope you'll be able to join tomorrow. Thank you all for joining today. Those were great questions. I appreciate them very much. Thank you very, very much, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you for taking part. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Bye.
Thank you.